In our last video, we discussed the unfortunate events of January 1675 on Assawampset Pond, where one of Philip's sachems and counselors, John Sassamon, met with misadventure while fishing through the ice, and his body was found a week later. Was it murder, as the English said, who had been using him as a spy inside Philip's council house? Or was it, as the native people said, just a simple accident on the ice, with Sassamon falling in and cutting his throat on the sharp shards? We don't know and just have to speculate about it. Who should we believe? In this episode, we're going to investigate the sources that I'll be using when I'm discussing the events of King Philip's War, or God's most dreadful judgment, or the Red King's Rebellion, or whatever you choose to call it. There are primaries, like those written by Mary Rowlandson and Benjamin Church. Increased Mather will also give us a window into the events of 1675. Primaries being sources written at the time. And then we have the work of historians from the last 400 years, really. So let's check out some of the sources that I've used to bring you this video series. And it's possible that you have some that I don't, and some insight into some things that I don't. Don't be afraid to share. Let me know. The series is in its infancy, and we're going to be working on this right through the anniversary years. So for the next 2 years, you can expect at least a video a month and probably more on King Philip's War. And with that, the sources. So taking a look at the sources that I'm going to be using in this video, I'll start with the very general stuff that I've got on early English colonization and on the native tribes of the Northeast. Now, First Frontier is a pretty cool secondary source that is written by a guy named R.V. Coleman. It's a reprint of an older book, and it really goes into a lot of the colonization by the Dutch, the French, and the many English colonies that are established here, offset against the various native tribes and the relationships between them. So this is like a place to start. You know, I always tell people it's a good idea if you get a sweep of the entire history first before you start getting into the details. If you're looking for something particular to the native people, Colin Calloway has this book that's used as a textbook in many colleges and any of their courses that study native people. And this is a fairly general source that will allow you to get up close and personal quickly with the native tribes of the Northeast. It's written in textbook style, so it's got a lot of images and maps, and the writing about each tribe is fairly brief. So that's Colin Calloway, and I really recommend him. If you want to know more about the native people, and this is something I feel like we all kind of know about the native people from documentaries on television and from westerns and that sort of thing, but is that really known? James Axtell is an ethnohistorian who really brought me into the study of the Eastern Woodland Indian, the native people. Way back in the 80s when I was getting my bachelor's, we had to do some work in the William & Mary Quarterly. And I read an article Axtell wrote, and the guy's a good writer, and he is investigating areas using the sources that other people don't want to go. This book, The Documentary History of the Sexes, this book will take you on a journey from birth to death for Native men and women using primary sources. It's really good, fascinating work, covers many tribes of the Northeast, but you get an overall picture that the world they're living in and the way they live is quite different from that which you might imagine. They're not out camping. They're not living the way we often stereotype them as having lived. They're human beings, and Axtell does them great justice in works like this, in his classic, The European and the Indian and the Invasion Within. These are outstanding. He's got others. I always recommend Axtell to anyone that wants to get in deep. You also have books like these I consider general, and we're looking at the spirit of the New England tribes, which is myths and legends of Massachusetts, southern New England's native people, talking about Maushop and Hubbamuck, native spirits, gods, and their various practices that are coming from primary sources collected back into the 18th century. Indians in New England before the Mayflower. It's an attempt to create their world using some of the journals kept by the early explorers and using a bit of speculation. Columbian Exchange right here gives you a sense of the world before the Europeans come, coupled with changes in the land. You read these two, Changes in Land by Cronin, which I'm sure you've got. And you'll be able to understand when you go outside that the world that you're seeing, the woodland world, because you probably want to go on a hike and have gone on hikes, is not the same as the one that met the eyes of the Europeans when they first came to the Northeast. It looks very different, and the plants and animal species were, in fact, often very different as well. So Columbian Exchange, which began with Columbus and is still going on today and normally gets us thinking about invasive species, and the Europeans and Asians thinking about invasive species because our species go over there and they're invasive. Now we get into the actual sources on King Philip's War, and we've got some primaries here, and we're looking at Mary Rowlandson, a woman who was captured in Lancaster, Massachusetts in February of 1676 and spent a degree of time with the native people right through May. She gives us first-hand accounts of their preparations for the Battle of Sudbury and real insight into what ends up happening to their resistance. Because if you study the war, you'll realize they were winning right up through May of 1676. Across the board, they had suffered a few reverses, but very small compared to the damage that they were inflicting on the English colonists. The Pensions of Springfield. Now this is a book that you can get online. There's a lot of available work by William Pension and his son John that give you a history of the Springfield colony and the whole Connecticut River Valley, really right through King Philip's War, where Pension was the major in command of the western defenses until his city was burned in October of 1675. He was heartbroken because who could believe that the native people that Pension's father had first met and had lived side by side with them would take up arms. And yet they did. Benjamin Church writes this great primary source in the early 18th century, right around the time of Queen Anne's War. And Church is a really important character in the development of what you might call the American way of war and understanding the English perspective from the battlefield. Church is at Almy's Peace Field, where the English attempt to attack Montauk, Philip's high seat, his defensive capital. He's going to be at the Great Swamp fight, wounded there, and he's going to put together his own unique trained band that will use native people, friendly native people, as scouts, dogs, and all kinds of assorted tactics. Church gives us a really neat account, and he was also quite friendly with the native people before the war began. We then have our secondary sources here. I have a bunch of them, and I'm not going to go into all of them. Many of them are from the 19th century, but George Ellis's King Philip's War and the Pictorial History of King Philip's War, written in 1850, great source that a lot of you are going to like, because I know a lot of you, from what you've written me, are into the study of your own family at the time and genealogy, and this book will give you a complete account of the various trained bands that are going to be fighting and the actions that they take part in. So a trained band is what they called militia, community militia, that were raised to defend the communities during the war, and this gives you the names of everybody that was registered in the trained band and then the battles that they fought in, the duties that they performed. Really great source.
And it also has a lot of capsulated histories that'll take you through the war. It's not necessarily a narrative, but it'll definitely be something that you'll enjoy. It's a great resource to have in the pursuit of King Philip's War. We also have a bunch of recent titles. When I say recent titles, we're talking about books that were written in the past 50 years. And we have to grab the classic Flintlock and Tomahawk, which is probably the best narrative history of King Philip's War that has been done to date. Problem with this is I feel like it could have better maps, and it would be nice if it had more illustrations. Maps of native people are very difficult to find, good ones at least. What happens is you get what's called parochial history, where a particular college professor is working on a particular project, and he focuses on the native people that live near his college, and they make awful generalizations in that way. And I feel like mapping the native people of southern New England, and the heck with that, the whole country, is something that really needs to be done. But it needs to be done with respect to the chronology, because if you know about native people, they were always moving around. The Pequot, who had been defeated in 1637 during the Pequot War by Captain Mason and others, had recently moved to what is now Connecticut from the Taconic Mountains, or as far away as the western shore of the Hudson. The state of Connecticut is currently going to rename the Thames River, the Thames River, in New London. They're going to rename that river the Pequot River, and I scratch my head and think, why not the Mohegan River? Why not the Niantic River? Why not the name of a tribe that had been in the area for at least historical time? We know the Pequots were newcomers, but they've got a casino. Anyways, Leach's book, you'll really enjoy it. A great narrative history. There are many others. I mean, there are books like this, Warpaths, which is a military history that's pretty cool. It's got some good stuff in it. In the Name of War by Jill Lepore is really the story of what the war means then and any when, now too, right? The memory of King Philip's War, the meaning of King Philip's War. It's a fun book, but it's more for someone that's read the sources and is looking for kind of tying it all together. You're not getting a really good military history here. You're not getting a good capsulated history of the various characters in the war. Although they're mentioned, and you'll find things in that you'll be able to use. The Red King's Rebellion is a brief story of King Philip's War. It's a narrative. It's reasonably good. It's not as good as Flintlock and Tomahawk, which it uses for a source quite a bit. I'm going to give you one here that I think you'll probably, if you do what I do, and you like what I'm doing, if you watched any of my other videos, I've made a lot of shorts on King Philip's War. I've made a few long videos on King Philip's War, like the one that I did on Bloody Brook that I'm going to revisit. This is Michael Tugis, and Michael Tugis wrote a novel. It's the only novel that I know of, and maybe there's others. Maybe some of you know of others, because I'd love to read it if you do. This is a novel about King Philip, and Until I Have No Country, I don't think it did really well, but it's not a very bad book at all. It's fun to read, so I don't want to give away any surprises, but I'd recommend picking that up if you want a good piece of historical fiction that's tightly tied to the facts. And then he wrote this excellent guidebook, really. It gives you the history of King Philip's War. The problem is he divides it by state or colony. So he's got Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And what he does in this is he basically is creating a touring guide. So you have Bloody Brook, and he's going to tell you how to get there today and where the monuments are, and there's decent maps, nice images, and a generally good story of the battle. Problem is, I feel like he arranges it by state, and that kind of hurts the flow of it. But I highly recommend Tugis' book if you haven't gotten it. And if you want to get out and explore the battle sites and the land where King Philip's War took place, if you're ever in southern New England, this is a valuable source to have. most recent book on King Philip's War would be Lisa Brooks. And Lisa Brooks wrote this, Our Beloved Ken. It's a fun book to read. It basically follows Mary Rowlandson and James Prenter, so a woman, I mentioned her already, who wrote us a primary source account of the war, and a praying Indian who's caught between two worlds. She also brings us up into Maine. It's like a book of self-discovery by the author, where she's learning about where she lives. She's learning about the hidden history of the region, and King Philip's War is where she's focusing. It's a fun book, but it doesn't really add much, in my opinion, to the story, other than furthering the story of James Prenter, which is cool. She did some great historical work to do that, but I find it left me wanting. We have others, Skulking Way of War, another military history that's looking at the war from the perspective of tactics and strategy. And this is a very general King Philip's War book. This is a fun one. Ghosts of King Philip's War. You gotta have something like this. I mean, if you're taking a tour of New England, oh, it's got a lot of pictures. It's kind of like a touring book. You're gonna want to get out there with your television clicker and wave it around and see if you can find any hot spots. I used to take care of an old house, and a historic house in the town that I teach in, and the ghost hunters came and they were waving around clickers, telling me that there were ghosts. Anyways, people are into this thing. Get out, get out and check it out if you're into that. And then there are some other books that I just think are great to have, and these books kind of round everything out. Everybody's heard of the attack on Deerfield in 1704, and I'll make a few videos on that soon. Well, not soon, but soon. And New England Outpost is a great one about Pecumtuck Deerfield. Captors and Captives, another one about Deerfield. And then finally, these two books, let me tell you, when we think about the events that occur in what's called King William's War and then Queen Anne's War, the depredations of the natives against the peaceful settlements of western Massachusetts and New York, Schenectady in particular. We're talking about native people who were driven out of southern New England and went up and joined the Caughnawaga Mohawk St. Francis tribe. Basically, they were wreaking vengeance as late as Queen Anne's War in 1704, 1705, 1706 for what they had once lost. So these are great informative pieces for you if you've gotten through King Philip's War and you're looking for more. A lot of the sources I use are town histories. And here's another one that kind of goes along with the last two. This is the Mohegans of Stockbridge that I will, again, bring you a special, separate set of works on. But the Mohegans of Stockbridge are living out there in the valley of the Housatonic where the last battle of King Philip's War takes place, and they're not caught up in it. And they're forgotten about. Of all the native people in southern New England, these are the ones that they don't have to ally with anybody. They just stay neutral, and they will survive as a free people like the Iroquois until after the American Revolution. And their story is a sad one, as the stories of most tribes are. This is a really well done book by a guy who was once the head librarian in the Library of Congress. So he used the sources he had to construct this. He probably had a house in one of America's first vacation towns, Stockbridge, which the native people are named after. I'm going to put a bit of a bibliography on the bottom of my video. I'll put it in the comments. If you're interested in sources or you have some that you'd like to share with me, reach out either in the comments or hit me up on the website that's attached to my YouTube channel. This is a work in progress. You might have things I haven't heard of before or seen. There's a lot of sources that I don't have with me here that are probably around my house somewhere or I've loaned to somebody. And then there's the town histories. There's so many great town histories that are available online. Look up the history of Hadley, Massachusetts, for instance, and you'll find all kinds of great in-depth accounts of the war there. Also, the history of Hatfield. Any of the towns that were around will have in their town histories quite a bit on this most awesome, forgotten period of American history. So here's our sources. I hope you enjoyed the video. And I know I'm spazzing out and waving them around, but I'll attach so you can get them yourself. So the next video I bring you will be a video about the people who were going to find themselves engaged in this most awful war. Neighbors in 1674, adversaries by the summer of 1675. And these are people from a variety of English colonies. These are people that are hacking their lives out of the wilderness. Native people who are living in tribes that have their own unique culture and heritage that goes back hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And there's no monolithic element to it at all. The native people were constantly in competition with one another and often at war. And the English colonies were on the verge of that as well. If you know the story of the Charter Oak and Governor Andros over in New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts and Plymouth and Rhode Island and New Hampshire's interrelationships, it's not a simple thing. And let me muddy the water a little with our next video. So we'll see you then.